SoundCloud. There we go. All right, so everyone, welcome back to week 4 of reading Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. I'm Rachel. I work with Lauren here at the Welty House, and she is away at a conference today, but we'll be sending out an email of this recording sometime later this week. So if you need to step aside or need to rewatch it later, you can get those emails and get that YouTube link. So with that in mind, I want to remind everyone that this is quite a large Zoom meeting. So if you want to comment, please either try to raise your hand or use the raise your hand function down in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to be on the lookout for people physically raising their hands, but there is a lot of people, or you can also just comment it in the chat. So with that in mind, I will hand it over to Jay here.
Thanks, Rachel. And really nice to see everybody again. I've been looking forward to this, and actually had to wait 3 weeks to see you guys again. From Suzanne's comments, it sounds like you've already begun a pretty lively conversation about section 2. So I think by way of a preamble, I really am going to have a little bit less to say this time than the first time I was with you. In part because the room was so full and there were so many people with questions. I kind of felt like I was taking your valuable time by going on at the beginning. So I'll just bring up a couple of things by way of framing section 2, and I think in a way you've already gotten a head start on these ideas from your previous conversation. Where we kind of ended up the last time that I was together with you and we were talking about section 1 was with this idea of Benji Compson as a son of the South. I mean, thinking about that Hebrew etymology of the name Benjamin and the way that Faulkner might be taking advantage of it to kind of offer us Benji as a living symbol for the 20th century Southerner and some of his dysfunctions and his kind of backward-looking qualities and his difficulties dealing with real life in the present moment. What I would add this time around is that I think in a way all of the Compson brothers are going to be sons of the South of one sort or another, but the big difference with Quentin, the big difference between Quentin and Benji is that Benji doesn't know he's a son of the South. I mean, Faulkner knows that, or he perhaps wants us to know it, to pick up on it. But Quentin very, very much knows that he's a son of the South, and his sense of his regional identity and what that means about his masculinity, what it means about his race, what it means about his responsibilities are all kind of hinging on that self-image as a Southerner. You see him thinking about it a lot up in New England, right, in the presence of Northerners in particular, but I think Quentin is very much preoccupied with the fact that he is a son of the South and has inherited Southern values, and that in turn shapes his difficulties or the kind of crisis that his sister represents for him. And that's kind of the other overarching thing I would say. It sounds like y'all have already started a kind of compare and contrast conversation about this, but what we're going to see is that each of the Compson brothers in his own way has a problem with Caddy, that Caddy in some fashion boils down the character's kind of gripe with the world. And in Benji's case, it's a very temperamental thing. I mean, Benji is really very sort of rigid in his outlook on life and expects order and familiarity and pattern in all of his experiences. And when he doesn't get that, he's deeply distressed. And Caddy is above all the kind of moving, changing, living, unpredictable force in his life that creates real problems for a temperament like that. Quentin's Caddy problems may have a kind of temperamental element like Benji's do, but they also go beyond that. I mean, they're deeply cultural and class-based and race-based, and they all stem from, again, Quentin's self-understanding of his Southernness, of his regional identity, in a way that shapes his Caddy problem and makes it even worse. So I just thought I would kind of lead with that. I mean, just thinking about kind of like what the caddy problem is for Quentin, what it represents, and what Quentin's intense self-consciousness about his Southernness seems to kind of, to bring to our experience of reading chapter 2. So those are just some, some opening thoughts, and it may be that your thoughts are going to take us in a completely different direction, or your questions, and that is fine too.
Any questions? We'll start us off. Do I see a hand? Well, let me start off then, because I'm wondering, Jay, what about Quentin's, as a Southerner, thoughts on race? There's a kind of ambivalence there, affection, need, but also condescension, dismissal.
Yeah, that all sounds right. I mean, I also think Quentin's experiences in the North are beginning to challenge some of the ideas he carries around about race. And again, maybe helping him understand those ideas as regional ideas that have to do with a particular kind of Southern white outlook more than anything just sort of commonsensical or obvious or universal. So riding the streetcar with African-American people, or interacting with Deacon, the fellow who seems to help students kind of move in and get acclimated at Harvard. These are experiences that are pushing him out of his racial comfort zone a little bit, where on the one hand, he can feel emotionally, he can feel real fondness for African Americans in his life, like Dilsey and Roscus, but on the other hand, it is condescending to them, and thinking in particular about the differences between white women and Black women in the South, as he understands it. I think one of the things that creates such a crisis for him, with his sister's sexual adventurousness, I want to keep hesitating from using words like promiscuity, and just sort of see Caddy as really exploring her sexuality and exploring life, is that Quentin can't associate that behavior with the behavior of a white woman in his world, with the behavior of a young lady like Caddy is supposed to be. He associates sexuality and sexual uninhibition with Black women. And so he'll accuse Caddy of this, at times, that she's acting like the way in his mind he understands Black women to act. So his racial attitudes very much create interference for him, in thinking about the meaning of his sister's life, and his sister's adventurousness and experimentation. And so we got to kind of think in an intersectional way about race, in particular where race and gender attitudes come together. Pose deep, deep problems for Quentin, because when his sister challenges those assumptions about race, gender, and sexuality, about women's sexuality in the South, in a way, she's bringing the entire family's white identity into doubt and into question for him. So on the one hand, Quentin may feel real love for some of the African-American characters in his life in Mississippi, but he's haunted by a fear of racial falling, by a fear that the Compsons may be in danger of their very whiteness being compromised, and it being Caddy's behavior that's threatening to compromise it. So that was a long answer to a short question.
Thank you. A good answer too. Marcia, Laura, and Elta. Marcia?
Yeah, one of the things that Faulkner does with race in the Quentin section is introduces irony, because the Quentin interacts with Deacon and seems to treat Deacon, and Deacon treats him just the way Deacon has set it up, where Deacon is pretending he's making his way in the world, making his living by playing into the stereotype of the Black man that's the Southern boys who come up to Cambridge know and understand. And so he takes advantage of that. And in fact, makes a fool of the Southern boys. We know that as the reader because we hear what he says and how he does it. So Faulkner clearly meant that to be an ironic view of the Southern boy in his concept of race. I don't think that Quentin, however, gets the irony of it. That's just a comment.
I would agree with that. And I would even add that Quentin is trying very hard with Deacon. I mean, in a way, he's trying to just kind of like, bracket race out of the deal and just level with this man, in kind of human terms. He's given it his best try, but by the end of that little scene with Deacon, he's getting a little bit defensive again about being Southern and about race. And so I'm looking at page 99 in that Vintage International paperback edition that probably many of you have. And this is when he's telling Deacon that he has left a little something for him to come by and pick up at his room tomorrow. And of course, what he's leaving is one of his suits because he's going, he plans to commit suicide. He's not going to need the suit. And Deacon is a little worried that he might be, playing a joke on him, that this might be something that's going to humiliate him. And he says, "You ain't playing a joke on me, is you?" And Quentin says, "I'm not." And then he says, "Did any Southerner ever play a joke on you?" And Deacon says, "You're right. They're fine folks, but you can't live with them." And Quentin says, "Did you ever try?" So the one moment when the kind of, the facade of just sort of man-to-man engagement slips a little bit. And, Deacon reminds Quentin of what he so painfully already knows, which is that he's a son of the South. Quentin pulls back, gets a little defensive, right? And in some ways starts questioning Deacon's credentials. Like, what would you know about people from the South? So I'd kind of throw that in there as a friendly amendment to your comment, Marcia. I think the racial fault lines are still surfacing, in that encounter with Deacon.
Yes, but I don't think Quentin appreciates how much Deacon is playing him.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Laura?
Oh, yep, I'm coming. Yeah, I don't want to at all move us away from race if that's somewhere that we want to stay and that Elta wants to comment on. But kind of going back to the first point of discussion, Suzanne, that you made, one of my interests in the whole of Faulkner's canon is this concept of virginity and this difference between male and female virginity as Quentin sees it, and the way that Mr. Compson sees it and kind of demeans it, which leads to Quentin's confusion. Like, you're telling me not to care about this concept, that it doesn't mean anything, and yet it seems like Southern honor is kind of bolstered by the conceptions. If that's somewhere we want to go, that's a topic that really interests me. But if race is where we stay, that's also a topic that really interests me.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's see what Elta's question is, and we'll either take your question first or second, depending on what Elta's is, right? Elta?
Well, I'm interested in the little Italian girl, and
we've got the intersection of race and gender here. Okay.
Absolutely. And the little dirty girl, and she doesn't speak, and Quentin is possibly perceived as a sexual predator. All of this, and the water, they look at the water. So I think I would really like to hear a whole lot about that episode. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount being projected onto that encounter and remembered during that encounter by Quentin. So it's obvious that for him, as well as, for Faulkner, this little episode, which goes on a long time, is a way for Quentin to kind of replay and rethink his relationship with Caddy. And again, the way that Caddy's own identity and kind of credibility as a young white lady has been damaged or has been jeopardized by her sexual behavior. So the fact that Quentin thinks of this little Italian girl sort of not only as ethnic, as kind of occupying a borderline whiteness, we might say, or a kind of whiteness in question, goes along with his thinking of her as a dirty girl, a dirty little girl, but also as someone that it is his responsibility to help and protect. And one thing that we might notice is that by this point in his life, Quentin doesn't really have Caddy to help and protect anymore. And one of the reasons why is that she's not particularly interested in that whole system of honor that, sees young women as vulnerable and defenseless and needing some sort of male authority figure to keep them safe. So she's not particularly interested in that whole set of assumptions that would lead Quentin to appoint himself as her guardian, her policeman, her surrogate father, since Mr. Compson seems to be falling down on the job. And at the same time, Caddy has kind of disqualified herself from needing that sort of help because she's acted in a way that Quentin finds dishonorable. We need to be aware of like how radically that shakes his self-image. So I think here we are still talking about race, and we're talking about gender, and we're talking about the Italian girl, and maybe some of Quentin's motives for wanting to, see her as needing protection.
Beverly?
My comment goes back to Marsha's, the comment about race, and the section that Jay pointed out between Deacon and Quentin, and Marsha saying, that she didn't think that Quentin knew that he was being put on. And when I read on through the rest of that section, I think that the code switching, Deacon's code switching in here is important. And of course, Quentin should have noticed the difference in Deacon saying, using the N-word, and you ain't playing a joke on, all of that. And then we get on the next page, and Quentin says, that you're a good fellow, you've helped a lot of fellows. I've tried to treat all folks right. I draw no petty social lines. A man to me is a man, wherever I find him. Now that is, that's not descendant of slave speaking. That's a person who knows what the situation is. And of course, we're in the North, but I think that code switching as he goes from what he thinks he needs to do with the Southern boy, and then he moves into the regular vernacular. And as Marsha said, I don't think Quentin notices that. I don't think Quentin realizes that he's out of his league. Deacon isn't, but Quentin is.
Yeah, up higher on that same page, I noticed that Deacon is also calling Quentin boy. And, while that might be age appropriate, right, in context, there's just that whole history of, Southern racial etiquette, such as it is, that, again, just won't recognize Black manhood and insists on calling Black men boy. So Deacon is kind of turning the tables on Quentin there. And it's right after Quentin has brought the whole Southern thing back into the conversation.
Sarah and then Harriet.
So I think my question might connect these two strands of conversation we're having about Quentin and Deacon and Quentin and the Italian girl. If Marsha and Beverly are correct in reading Quentin as not understanding Deacon, I wonder, Jay, about Quentin not understanding the Italian girl at all, because we get this really long section where he's walking around with her, assuming she can't speak English. And then at the end of the section, there's that really funny moment on 139 where she says, "There's Julio." Right. So are we supposed to take that to mean that Quentin also is an unreliable narrator and didn't understand anything that went on with that little girl and that experience?
Well, I on the one hand, I think Quentin is totally unreliable as a narrator, right? In a way, all throughout the section, his thought process is so distorted by kind of the enormity of his crisis and his despair that it's we might be able to trust Quentin on kind of reporting details in a way, the way that we can trust Benji. But I mean, I think we've got to be prepared for how much Quentin is missing, because he's so obsessively focused on what he is focused on. So, I mean, to me, what's also interesting is the Italian girls kind of like withholding or, waiting to use English until so deep in their encounter, which might imply that she is being a little bit more cautious around him than he thinks she is being, right? And maybe with good reason, or maybe not with good reason. But I mean, I think we're learning a little bit about what it might mean to be, an ethnic stranger in a community, the way that the Italian girl and her family, is. And I think, again, Quentin can only see that in terms of like vulnerability and, dependency and need. And this may be a sharp little customer that that he is hanging out with. We certainly see the lady at the bakery, right, kind of jumping to conclusions about who she is and what she is. And so Quentin is no less susceptible to that, I would think.
Harry?
So this is maybe a question about the Old South and modernity. I'll get there maybe. I want to say I think about Quentin Compson in relationship to words that he's had from Mr. Compson, but that Mr. Compson, as we've been saying, will now tell him are just words. And in the scene where Quentin comes across the boys deciding how they're going to spend the money from a fishing contest they haven't entered, the book's narrator, which interjects in a way that I'm trying to figure out where that voice is coming from, to say that the boys were using words to make unreality an incontrovertible fact, as people will when their desires become words. So I'm thinking now about Quentin's problem words as an attempt to hold on to an Old South social order that he's grown up thinking with. Words like honor, integrity, chivalry, gentility, paternalism, that now are all tied up in this concept of protected white female virginity. And now I'm kind of jumping and want to say, as somebody who's thought a lot about modernity and Faulkner, I'm trying to think about the ways in which the modern is challenging Quentin in this section. And I'm thinking about the little Italian girl along those lines. I'm thinking about Deacon along those lines. Have you thought about this? And are there other ways in which you think modernity is imposing its presence? I mean, maybe I haven't defined. I don't think I've defined, how the little Italian girl is that is thinking about immigration in America and changing ethnic groups. And but so anyway, I'm just kind of wondering if you thought about that specifically for this section.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of ways Quentin's intelligence and consciousness, might suggest to us his streams of consciousness. The narration might suggest to us a pretty sophisticated kind of modernism, an expressive modernism on his part. But I do think he's kind of, he's constantly bumping his head against various aspects of, let's just say, the 20th century world. I mean, we can call it modernity, we can call it other things. And what I would add to your list, it's not only the kind of social changes that in a way a kind of more globalized and industrialized, society is bringing to his world, but even technological changes. So I think about Quentin as someone who is kind of like trying to function in the, streetcar and commuter rail system of like, of the Boston, Cambridge area. And in some ways, he's quite adept at it. In other ways, he gets lost in his thoughts and, misses a train and has to wait for the next streetcar. And so even those kinds of negotiations, which you might hold up against his sort of fantasy of the South as all boiling down to a black man sitting on a mule, at a railroad crossing, while Quentin kind of offers him a condescending gift. there are all kinds of ways in which the social changes and then the real kind of material technological changes that, you know, that make the modern city are all challenging Quentin kind of at the same time and getting bound up in each other. But one of those most important changes, I think, is kind of the, you know, like the racial progress coming to the South. And so it's one thing to grapple with that, with racial change on a streetcar in Cambridge, but to, you know, but to think back about what that might mean in Jefferson is to land back on Dilsey's and Roscus's faces and examples. And I think, you know, again, something that kind of like harks back to Quentin's past and pulls him back toward the past. So in addition to virginity, you know, one of Quentin's problem words is again, right? I think he says again is the saddest word, you know, this idea that things just are going to keep on happening and moving on into the future where was, right? The past word is the peacefulest word to him, right? Kind of the peacefulest sound. So the fact that a lot of this harks back to, you know, Quentin's got one foot in modernity and this other foot, you know, in the Old South and these ideas about class and honor. And, you know, I mean, that results in a real divided consciousness.
Earl or Tom, or both?
Not yet.
James,
It's Tom.
that Quentin's encounter with the little girl in the North is a repetition of Caddy catching him dancing, sitting down with Natalie, the dirty girl. And it's obviously they're playing a little sexual game, and Caddy stops them, and she runs Natalie off to the home, and then she and Quentin get into a fight in the hog wallar on the family farming land or whatever you want to call it on the place there, and they get themselves, you know, I mean, it's incredibly dirty, and that makes sexuality incredibly dirty forever. So that Natalie, the little girl in Haven, is also dirty in a way. For Quentin, then it's a repetition of that event in their childhood that turns him, I think it turns him against sexuality in a healthy way, of any kind of healthy way of it, from that very beginning, from that scene in the on the Compson Place.
It's also an attempt to kind of like, you know, take the dirty girl, you know, I mean, and push her back into childhood. So, I mean, to the extent that you're bringing up kind of that the dirty girl is Natalie, then that puts this whole really chilling subtext over that entire encounter. And, you know, maybe Julio is not so wrong to be worried about the kind of sexual threat that Quentin might represent, or maybe the justice of the peace is not so wrong about that. At the same time, you know, she's Caddy. She's not just Natalie, but she's Caddy.
Right.
And to the extent that he sort of needs her and wants her to be Caddy, I think there's a powerful element of wish fulfillment, as if he could kind of push that dirty girl back, you know, to the point where she's just a child, and these questions of that, you know, that emerge in Caddy's adolescence just haven't arisen yet. But in a way, can you ever push her back far enough? Because kind of like in the earliest thing anybody remembers in the novel, right, Caddy is already getting her drawers muddy. So again, just this idea that it might be possible somewhere or at some time to achieve this kind of this state of purity is a losing proposition.
I would just add that all of this is happening, especially with the Italian girl, as he's contemplating suicide, and every time he makes a step forward, something pushes him back and makes him have to again, you know, make his plan. And so as a reliable narrator, absolutely not. I mean, he's completely out of reality. And so that affects all his choices. So you're right, he could never be a reliable narrator of his own life. How many of us are reliable of our own identities?
Well, I am.
I used to think I was, but I changed my mind.
Yeah. Just joking. Any more questions? More questions? All right, Jacob, and then Sarah.
Hey, Jay, good to see you again.
Hey, Jacob.
I want to ask
Hey,
you
you know,
about,
I should add, like, you don't have to know me personally to ask a question. I mean, it might look that way from the queue, but it's like, you don't have to be one of my students or colleagues to actually make a comment or pose a question.
well, I want to ask you a question about the conversation Quentin has, I think, with Herbert Head by the mantle. I wanted to hear about what you think about that character, his characterization. Not surprisingly, when I read this section again, I thought Herbert Head is remarkably hard-boiled, his toughness, and Quentin is doing his best to kind of mirror that toughness by threatening him, bring a gun to the situation. There's if I remember, a cigar or a cigarette on the mantle. So I was interested in what anyone else thinks or what Jay thinks about that particular character, because he is such an obverse version of Quentin. And he's, almost trying to teach Quentin, like, don't take life so hard, grow up. Don't stop being so idealistic. You can make it through this.
Yeah, it's sort of a preview for the father telling him that, it may really, really hurt now. And you may feel like this is like the end of the world, and that, Caddy's virginity is just the biggest deal imaginable, but it's not always going to hurt like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Herbert is saying, I mean, he's talking about himself, right? Because Herbert is dishonorable. And Quentin knows this about him, right? That he cheated at Harvard. And so he got thrown out of Harvard. And what Herbert is trying to say about that, which is the preview for sort of all Quentin's other problems, is, it's just, I mean, you're young, but it's just not that important. You get along a little bit farther in life, and it's not as important as you think it is. So there is a trial run, for this, this challenge to Quentin to understand kind of, the crises and the really deep pains of the moment he's in, as things that might ease with time, that might heal with time. But, Quentin sees time as his enemy. And in a way, the fact that time might change things, or that might, make things easier, that's his whole problem in the first place, because time changed Caddy. And so, and what that has done is put the family's reputation, his and its racial integrity, their, position in town, it's put all of that in flux. So it's hard to reassure Quentin with time, right? When Quentin has turned time into, like his sort of epic antagonist. And that goes all the way down to the way he envisions committing his suicide, and the way I assume he does kind of execute his suicide, right? Which is to jump in that river, which in some ways is an extension of the stream that Caddy, right, was so willing and eager to, dip her toe in, to enter and experience all the way back in their childhood. And it's kind of Quentin's attempt to turn that scene around and sort of, and defeat the creek, defeat the branch by drowning himself in the river, and moreover, holding himself down there,
Mm-hmm.
with those flat irons where his body won't drift downstream. And in a way, it'll kind of be his victory over the flow of time. So he's got, in his imagination, he's got his suicide choreographed, all the way down to the last detail, in order specifically to respond to, these problems that he has had with Caddy, and with just the work of time and change in his world.
So, and so the kind of the tragedy, the kind of ironic tragedy, it seems to me, is that what kills Quentin is his idealism, right? He wants to make like death by heroic gesture. So in a way, I mean, Herbert, his dishonor is almost offering a lifeline to Quentin to save him.
Yeah.
Don't take things so harsh, and you'll make it through this life.
Yeah.
So his southernism, his desire to be perfect, is the thing that kind of pushes him overboard in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, Quentin, he bristles at the suggestion, right? That anything other than than honor, right? Anything other than the most honorable conduct could somehow be less than earth-shaking, right? And so, as a result, he kind of, Quentin is also a hothead. You think of him as just completely lost in his own head, and in some ways just, so contemplative, like Hamlet, right? I mean, so contemplative that he can't figure out a way to live, or he can't decide what he needs to do next, including, the question of to be or not to be. But he's also really, really rash and impulsive. And you see this in like all the fights that he's getting into with boys and men, or the near fights. So, strangely enough, it's Herbert who has to dial down that encounter, right? Because Quentin is, I mean, it's like fighting words, right? That, you're overreacting to all this. It's not the biggest, cheating isn't the biggest deal in the world. And in a sense, you can kind of, the text is practicing for the later scene, although chronologically it's earlier, when he's going to try to run Dalton Ames out of town, right? Like he's been watching some kind of bad Western, I'll give you till sundown to get out of town. You're going to get out of town or else. So, no wonder Dalton Ames pulls a pistol. He understands, like, they're acting parts in a Western right now. And again, Quentin is trying to kind of like stroll onto the scene like the cowboy or the man of honor, and, like enforce this standard on everybody.
And it's racialized. I mean, like you said, he's imagining Dalton Ames in a sundown town situation, get out of my town before the night falls, making him the kind of blackened, dishonorable figure.
Yeah, that's a nice point. I hadn't thought of that.
Sarah?
So I was just going to sort of forward on a question that the group had, Jay, a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the Quentin section, that I found very helpful I've just taught this in an undergraduate class, and I think especially if you're a first reader. So someone in the group, and I'm sorry I don't remember who it was, asked about Quentin's sense of Caddy. Is it protection of Caddy or jealousy of Caddy? And I thought that was an interesting question. And I thought the group was really interested in that a couple of weeks ago. So I thought I would just forward and pitch that to you. Do you read Quentin as protecting Caddy or jealous of Caddy, or both, or not?
Both. Yeah, I absolutely don't think it's an either or question. I mean, I think what he is most jealous of is her sexual experience. Because, and right, in other words, like the same thing that, that just completely shatters and alarms him, is the thing that, of course, would be completely appropriate if he had it. So there's this topsy-turvy thing again that has happened, to the daughter and son in this honorable family. It's like, there's a real sexual double standard there, even among the elite honorable class, where sexual experience for the young men is presupposed. And this goes all the way back, I mean, to Harriet's Old South, where that kind of sexual experience was readily available, right, through enslaved women. So that's the part of Quentin that I think is jealous of Caddy, in a sense that she has inappropriately experienced what would be more appropriate for him to experience. Why is it me and not her who had to be virgin? I think he either wonders aloud or he wonders to his father, I think, at one point about that. But then there's the other line, where he says that, like, he and his father protect women. Like, that's the role of being a good Compson man. We protect women. We protect them from themselves, right? Seeing them as, the weaker vessel and lacking the kind of judgment and reason that men have. And Mr. Compson may be really, really kind of like fatalistic and philosophical about virginity. But I think he helps encourage Quentin to see those gender differences. So if Mr. Compson won't play that role of protecting Caddy, then it falls to the eldest son to do that, right, within the sphere of honor. And so I do think that, that the protection is, and discipline, right? The flip side of protection. It's there. It goes all the way back to the very first scene at the branch, the thing Benji so compulsively remembers, where, Quentin is wagging his finger at Caddy and telling her not to get in the water. All right. Like, if she gets in the water, there's going to be trouble. Or if she lets Versh unbutton her dress, which is enormously loaded, right? If this little white girl lets this little black boy unbutton her dress, all hell is going to break loose, right? I mean, everybody's going to get in trouble. So in a way, Quentin is kind of never not protecting Caddy, and he's never not failing to protect Caddy. So can I have it both ways like that, Sarah?
Other questions?
So y'all, why is suicide any kind of a solution to this problem? You know, if we've been kind of delving a little deeper into what the problem is in the first place and how this whole problem, you know, boils down around Caddy, then we also ought to be thinking about the various kinds of solutions that Quentin imagines and tries out to his solutions to his problem that he experiments with either in his imagination or eventually like in reality, to just try to kind of understand what the motives are behind that. Right. So I mean, like, you know, he not only commits suicide, but there's a scene where he sort of proposes a murder suicide with Caddy. You know, he tries to tell his father that he's the father of Caddy's child, you know, and not these lovers and suitors. These are all imagined solutions to his problems, and they might strike kind of a, you know, an ordinary reader or a common sense reader as really, really unhinged, right? Unworkable, doomed solutions. So is it interesting at all to y'all to kind of like reconstruct Quentin's thought process behind these, you know, various solutions that he comes up with to his problem or his possible solutions?
Harriet and then Elta.
Yeah, you don't have to answer that, Harriet.
Oh,
Well, let's come back to that. Yeah.
yeah, no, I did want to talk about that. I mean, the other problem word that we didn't mention was temporary. And I think that, Mr. Thompson promises him essentially the same promise that Herbert Head makes, that this pain that he's feeling, this despair in the loss of his ideals or the ways in which they're unreal, won't last. He says, of course, he's not really in danger of committing suicide. Mr. Thompson does in this, whether it's a conversation he had with his father or an imagined conversation that he had with his father. Mr. Thompson both tells him that he thinks he's not going he doesn't have to worry about him because what's really tragic is not feeling despair and the state that Mr. Thompson is in. And at the same time, he promises him that is going to happen. As Herbert Head says, in 10 years, this won't matter to you. So suicide, it seems to me, is a way to keep the future of loss of those despair about ideals from happening.
Yeah, it stops the clock.
Yeah.
I love
And,
what you said too.
and Jason
about
is
that.
Jason is going to use that phrase to describe
Mhm.
the suicide of his brother in section
Yeah.
3. He's going to talk about stopping his, how you stop your clock in his family.
Yeah.
You might drink yourself to death, or you might go swimming at night without knowing how to swim.
No spray. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love your comment too about the flat iron. So he's into the river of time, but he is not moving with time.
Mhm.
Stop. Yeah. Elta.
And, I think like what Jacob would probably catch with the Flatiron details is, again, the racial inflection of the Flatirons. So, like the ironing and the washing would have been associated with Black women in Quentin's time. And the novel confirms this because you hear Mrs. Thompson telling Caddy to stand up straight because she doesn't want Caddy looking like a washerwoman with bad posture. And like all of this stuff is racially inflected. So we would kind of need to process the additional irony or the additional complication that what Quentin weighs himself down with, right, is also this racially charged, kind of object from his Southern world.
Elta, Marcia, and then Pearl and Tom. Go well.
I'll just say quickly that I think the stopping time is it's so critical here, and combined with Quentin's impotence, because he had a hard time destroying his watch, just stopping the ticking, which was crazy. He's been been impotent and ineffective virtually everything he's tried to do. And this is something he can do and succeed in, and it will stop time and stop the despair.
Okay, Marcia.
Well, this may be a really false reading, but when Quentin first gets off the streetcar at the place where he can see Gerald Bland come out with his rowing school, and it's clear that he's admires Gerald. I had to wonder whether there was a homoerotic theme, and whether Quentin, part of his impotence is that, and part of his obsession with Caddy and her sexuality is that he has not been able to be sexual because he is actually gay. Has that ever been discussed and then later when he beats up Gerald on the question of, have you ever had a sister, which is such a, I don't know, made up, phony kind of anger to take out on Gerald. But maybe what his anger is that Gerald is content, very happy to be with women. And that's not Quentin's orientation. Is that just an idea that I've been reading too much current stuff?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I don't think it's anachronistic, or like presentist to see it that way. I think, and there are a lot of Faulkner readers and critics who share this idea that Quentin is very confused about his own sexuality, that he certainly is capable of remarking on beautiful, attractive men, like Dalton Ames and like Gerald Bland. So just one more reason to get them confused in his imagination, right, is that there may be an element of attraction on his part. He has a very close relationship with Shreve, right? I mean, how erotic it might be to either one of them, we don't quite know here. Actually, if you meet him again in Absalom, and kind of their interaction gets a little bit more erotically charged there, in part because they're doing all this great storytelling together, and that gets the blood running. So I think we could say not only does his impotence frustrate him, but his difficulty even knowing what it is he does or should want sexually. That certainly would pose some obstacles. If he's more responsive to men, it would pose some obstacles to, losing that virginity that Caddy has already lost first. That would be a more difficult proposition in his world.
It would leave him
I don't think you're out on a limb to see that at all.
It would explain also part of his depression and his anger, so much anger that comes out, like when he decides to just beat up Gerald. It seemed completely uncalled for.
Well, that could also be, I'm kind of rolling with your thinking here, but that could be the intimacy he desires that he can't get in any other way from Gerald.
Oh, that's women in love and the guys wrestling, right? Well, anyway, that was just a thought.
Pearl and Tom.
Okay, start again.
The tag team.
Okay. Quentin's name is a little odd in some respects. He's named probably for Quentin Roosevelt, the fifth child of Teddy Roosevelt, who went to Harvard, had a fiance, went off and joined the military service to be a pilot, and was killed in combat with the Germans just a few days after Faulkner reported for service in Canada to learn to do the same thing for himself. Because Faulkner, I think, was somewhat suicidal at that point in his life when Estelle had married somebody else and gone off, and he was talking dangerously in different kinds of ways. And then he goes off to Harvard with, maybe not Harvard, but to
New Haven.
With Phil Snowman, but turns the novel into Harvard, where Quentin Roosevelt went before he dropped out to do all that. And so I think it touches, that touches Faulkner's own sense of being suicidal when he did this. And so Quentin's response really echoes probably Faulkner's own memory of his response. And then he gives him a name that doesn't really make any sense in terms of family naming, because he was the last, not the oldest child or whatever.
Not the fifth child.
Yeah, I mean, it does, in a way, it doesn't make sense yet in terms of family naming. I mean, later in his career, Faulkner's going to go back and give the family a genealogy, and they're going to be Quentins in it, right? But not, we don't know that yet in The Sound and the Fury, where it looks kind of strange that, it was the second born son that wound up getting the father's name.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Although I also think, I mean, while we're riding our hobby horses, about Quentin, I think it's a name that, Faulkner and maybe the Compsons also are getting from Walter Scott, right? From one of his romances, from Quentin Durward. And which would kind of bring us to like all of Mark Twain's comments and, criticisms of how, like, the Old South was just completely hung up on Walter Scott, and that reflected, so many of their problems. This is just something I'm aware of because I ultimately got my middle name from that same novel. My grandfather's name was Durward. His name was Durward Watson, and it is just ironclad that his parents named him after that Walter Scott novel. There was nobody else to name him after, and they were sharecroppers. So, like, the Southern thing with Walter Scott kind of goes all the way down the class ladder among white Southerners. But I just can't help but think, that Quentin Compson and I, we share this literary reference in our names.
I wanted to add too, when we're talking about Quentin's sexuality and time and the ways of stopping time or converting time to something else in the past, the present, and the future, that we have to remember that his younger brother, Benji, was castrated. So time was stopped for him for his sexuality. Jason is too young to give any sort of models. And then, of course, the father is completely inept in being able to give any sort of guidance to him. But that idea that Benji's future was stopped with the castration, again, supposedly he being dirty to the girls going by.
Yeah, again, and I mean, it will be, right? It's sort of like we've encountered it in the novel, but it's not going to happen until after Quentin has died.
Right, after Quentin's death.
So yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think, yes, there's a lot Faulkner is tying together there, whether it could have been in Quentin's consciousness or not. And this is just the way he's constantly like laying down breadcrumbs, so that we can eventually follow the trail.
Sorry, I got my chronology mixed up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're two different chronologies, right? I mean, there's Quentin's and then there's the readers. So I know Harriet wants to say something, but I just want to jump in here and add, one other way to stop your clock, right, is to get yourself condemned to hell for all eternity. And remember that kind of part of Quentin's incest fantasy, right? Part of this cover story that he concocts, right? That, Caddy's child is actually his. It's not just about sort of giving the baby a more reputable father, like a boy from a good Southern family as the father, however deranged that plan might sound in taking the form of incest. It's also about getting the two of them punished and condemned to hell, right? Where they'll burn in the clean flame forever and ever, and they'll be alone and nothing will ever change, right? I mean, he'll never lose her. So his ability to romanticize hell and what hell would mean and to idealize that scenario of punishment also, it tells us just how desperate he is in his thinking and his fantasizing around this problem. But that's a solution that he can't bring about because he can't convince anybody to believe it.
That's just what I was going to say. That we hadn't talked yet about the incest lie. It's come up a couple of times in the chat, but we haven't talked about it. And it is, it's a strategy for protecting this idea of protecting against the idea of kind of casual experimental sexuality in a young woman. He needs it to be sin. It also solves his problem, his own sexual problem, by making him, he does. I was thinking back to Jacob's talking about hard-boiled Quentin. He does put on these very super masculine movie roles in both his relationship with Dalton Ames and Herbert Head, and maybe too in this incest lie. But I just wondered if we had anything new to say about the incest lie, as sometimes just muttering about these things. We find new tracks. Anybody thinking about the incest lie? Jay, you?
Yeah, it does multiple kinds of work for him. So we've already mentioned a couple of them. I mean, so as you're pointing out, it would make him sexual, and it would make him heterosexual, and it would make him the sexual instigator, because in, kind of claiming the incest lie, he also wants to claim, I made her do it, right? I made her do it. He even tells that to her, right? Like, you don't remember, it was actually me and I made you do it. Which would also kind of, to a degree, it would rescue some of her sexual honor, right? But I just think it also shows you kind of how in Quentin's imagination, the sin of incest, the sin of too much sameness, of too much consanguinity, is preferable, right, to the sin of fornication and too much difference, and even the kind of little overtones of miscegenation that hover around Caddy's sexuality, because everybody, the family knows Caddy goes off and sees men, but they don't know anything about the men. And so in the turn of the century South, in this elite white family, right, one of the part of the paranoia might be that Caddy is crossing the color line in these, these assignations. So
Mrs. Collins seems to be worried about who Dalton Ames is.
And
what really bothers her is that she doesn't know who he is.
Who his people are.
Yeah.
Doesn't know who his people are. Because that's how you know, right? I mean, that's how you know that the color line is still intact. So in all of those very useful ways to Quentin, it sexualizes him. I think it's useful to him because it would stop the clock, right? The scenario would stop the clock. And I mean, if you'll allow me to read a passage where I think this really comes home, it's on page 116. And it's one of the times that Quentin fantasizes about this, scenario in hell, being punished with Caddy for incest, is when he's looking down in the river and he sees this trout, and the trout is holding itself still in the current of the river. And in a way that kind of explains it, it visualizes what Quentin aspires to, not only in kind of holding himself in the current of the river by means of his suicide, but kind of in holding himself and Caddy in the clean flame. So down at the bottom, he's talking about the fish. He says, I could not see the bottom, but I could see a long way into the motion of the water before the eye gave out. And then I saw a shadow hanging like a fat arrow, stemming into the current. So that shadow is sort of his alter ego. It's like what he would like to be. Mayflies skimmed in and out of the shadow of the bridge just above the surface. And now we go into italics to some other time or place when he's entertaining the incest fantasy, right? So the juxtaposition is very telling. If it could just be a hell beyond that, the clean flame, the two of us more than dead, then you will have only me then, the two of us amid the pointing and the horror beyond the clean flame. And then back to the fish. The arrow increased without motion, stopping the clock. Then in a quick swirl, the trout lipped a fly beneath the surface with that sort of gigantic delicacy of an elephant picking up a peanut. The fading vortex drifted away downstream, and then I saw the arrow again, nose into the current, wavering delicately to the motion of the water above which the mayfly slanted and poised. Only you and me then, amid the pointing and the horror, walled by the clean flame. The trout hung delicate and motionless among the wavering shadows. So as in Benji's section, right, sort of where the juxtaposition between time levels will often, bring out elements of each one that you wouldn't see if they were only there alone. In Quentin's section, sometimes just the juxtaposition of these individual thoughts or kind of lines of thought, will shed a lot of light on each other. So forgive me for nerding out there a minute, but that's a passage that really helps kind of gloss what's going on with the incest fantasy.
I love looking at that passage. Thank you. And I think that is where we're going to have to stop, Rachel. Is that right? So
Yes, yeah, we're at time.
next time, we will talk about Jason's section. The man who who says his brother has stopped his clock, and then we'll have Jay in 2 weeks. So we look forward to that. We'll struggle on without you, Jay, and look forward to your return.
It sounds like y'all are doing great without me. Thanks,
See you next
everybody.
time.
It was fun being here.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you.